Good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation is quite a departure from the past two, both climatically and typologically, and I'll be describing research on this topic from the residents' perspective. Just want to set the scene. This is Brisbane, Queensland, the centre of a metropolitan region located in the subtropical humid climate zone on latitude 27.5 degrees south, which is a lot like Fort Lauderdale here in the States. City population is just over 1 million in a conurbation of nearly 3 million. And in this place, the ambient outdoor temperature is within the comfortable range for most of the year, though solar radiation and humidity can be really intense in summer. And while there are about 10 heat discomfort days or uncomfortable days per year, the city really only experiences a day or two over 95 degrees annually and rarely dips to freezing. So the macroclimate presents a combination of tropical and temperate characteristics at different times of the year and sometimes at different times in the same day. So during autumn, winter and spring, overnight temperatures are often cool to cold while the days can be actually warm to hot. And so the climate is actually conducive to an outdoor lifestyle all year round. And shady verandahs are deployed in residential buildings of all scales to act to reduce the intensity of heat and glare entering interiors during summer and provide popular outdoor living spaces. And during the mild winters, people often seek to sit out in the sun's warmth. So with conditions like these, Brisbane really should have a head start in the sustainability agenda. So although semi-outdoor living spaces such as verandahs, patios and balconies can be found in all latitudes, in the subtropics where climatic conditions are so benign, these spaces reflect a cultural preference for outdoor living and have long been an integral architectural feature of the housing vernacular. But Brisbane's transforming from a predominantly low-density, low-rise city to significantly denser and higher urban form. And tall apartment buildings are making a dramatic impact on the city's skyline, as in many other cities globally. And also, where the CBD and Riverside were once the domain of apartment towers that afforded premium amenity through views, breezes and open space, towers are now under construction citywide. And several concerning trends are emerging in apartment architecture in Brisbane. Generic designs that ignore the natural attributes of place are proliferating, and balconies are constructed with transparent glazed balustrades. Facades are extensively glazed and dwellings have extremely limited private external space, literally no balconies. And of course I couldn't help but notice in several of the presentations today that the glass-clad apartment building occurs all around the world in places like Toronto and Vancouver, Seattle and so on. Rather than complementing private outdoor living space, communal open space in apartment buildings is increasingly framed as a substitute for private balconies. And this morning I heard Rick Clark mention that millennials are looking for less personal space and more social space. And I've got a hunch that that's because personal space is decreasing so much that they actually do want more social space. As these large-scale multi-owner buildings are going to impact the urban and the housing environment for decades to come, it's imperative that they provide desirable dwellings for the local population and can be embraced by the wider community rather than rude. I hear a lot of people in Brisbane talk about the apartment buildings that are developing as soul-destroying. Anyway, I just should stay away from that emotional language because I'm actually here to talk about the research that I've conducted. Meanwhile, as with trends in multi-storey apartment building design itself, much research into the links between the architecture and resident satisfaction has emanated from temperate climate countries where severe cold weather constrains access to the outdoors much of the time. So in this paper, I look specifically at occupants' perceptions of livability of apartments in the context of the Australian subtropical city where outdoor lifestyles are the norm. Now, it's well established in social science literature that residents' livability expectations of a dwelling place are derived from pleasurable physiological and psychological experiences. And in the residential environment, which is made up of the dwelling, the neighbours and the neighbourhood, private outdoor space is an extension of the home and offers residents access to the external social and physical environment with some degree of privacy and territorial control. So the extent to which residents are able to enjoy these spaces undisturbed and yet engage with adjacent communal or public outdoor spaces significantly related to the concept of community attachment. This concept is important in the multi-residential building where a sense of community amongst residents is essential for harmonious and efficient building governance. And shared outdoor spaces in apartment buildings are potentially an important setting for residents to establish social interaction with their neighbours. So in order to investigate these concepts in the context of emerging trends in apartment design, this presentation focuses on a subset of the data collected in a large study undertaken at the Queensland University of Technology that investigated subtropical high-density living through residents' first-hand evaluations of their everyday experiences of the residential environment using a randomised survey and follow-up interviews. 8 inner urban neighbourhoods were purposively selected for this study as already supporting residential densities greater than the conventional Brisbane suburbs, though still lower than many other cities. We explored the presence, use of and importance to residents of private gardens and balconies and shared outdoor spaces, and we investigated their perceptions of privacy, the extent to which they were aware of noises or other annoyances, and their opinion of their dwellings' suitability for living in the subtropics. And we also asked them what they'd like to change about their current outdoor space. In total, over 2,000 questionnaires were delivered with a 28% response rate. Mostly closed questions had a yes or no response and a variety of 5-point Likert scales, typically ranging from 1 not at all to 5 extremely, with 3 fairly being the midpoint. Follow-up interviews with 24 residents explored the issues that were raised in more depth. The majority of the survey respondents were females, 60%, compared to 51% for the Brisbane area. And people aged in the 25 to 44 and over 65 age groups were similar to the wider Brisbane area, but people in the 45 to 60 age group, say the empty nesters, were actually a much higher group in this survey than the wider Brisbane area, so 36% compared to 26%. And most households consisted of 2 adults or 1 person, and only 7% of the households living in apartments had children younger than 18 years old, compared to 21% in the wider Brisbane area. The number of renters in the study was higher than the Brisbane area, and the remainder were either owners, evenly split between owners, or paying off a mortgage. The average period of residency in their present dwelling was 3 years and 5 months, while the longest was 39 years and the shortest had only been a month. And respondents to the survey lived on various floor levels up to the 19th floor, and the majority were located on the lower levels. On average, the dwellings had 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1 living room, usually combining kitchen and dining, a laundry, a car park, and 2 private outdoor spaces. Only 16% had a garden, but most, 83%, had not been seeking a garden when choosing their accommodation. 89% had 1 or more balconies, and the majority of the respondents spent on average 1 hour or more per week on their balcony and used it for a wide variety of social and non-social domestic activities. We found that the top 4 balcony uses were entertaining, cooking and dining, growing and tending plants, and drying laundry, though in some cases building governance bodies considered activities such as drying laundry to be unacceptable uses of balconies and requested these to be carried out indoors. As one resident explained, we virtually have to dry everything because we have strict rules. You shall not hang washing out on the balcony, and that's common to most properties. Some residents appreciated an access to an alternative private outdoor utility area. Approximately 1 in 5 residents used their balcony for other activities, including just the everyday things that people do in their everyday lives: reading, relaxing, studying, keeping pets, doing hobbies, exercising. And 19% stored household goods on the balcony. So if you have a look at, I'm not sure how this thing works, but somebody's got their spare furniture stacked up on the balcony there. Residents also considered their balcony to be a social buffer zone. It not only offered them an alternative place to be within the dwelling, it was used to manage visual and acoustic boundaries between the dwelling and the outside world. Privacy was highly valued, but more residents, 88% of residents, considered oral privacy to be important to extremely important than they did visual privacy. 42% of the sample found the sound of laughter and voices to be one of the major annoyances of high-density living, which is a conundrum when most of them report that they use their balcony for entertaining. So the sound of other people enjoying themselves is a problem. Data from interviews also suggested that most residents were conscious of managing boundaries and moderating their behaviour when outdoors to avoid bothering their neighbours. And residents didn't like overlooking their neighbours, nor did they like to be overlooked. In terms of suitability for subtropical living, the survey identified residents' preference for natural ventilation. 83% nominated that they were most likely to open windows and doors when thinking about climate control in summer, and continuous air conditioning was rarely desired. While 78% reported having air conditioning in their dwellings, 61% used it only on a few days or nights when really needed in summer, while 9% used air conditioning throughout summer. In interviews, residents explained how their balcony succeeded or failed to capture morning or afternoon sun in winter, and whether it excluded sun in summer or allows them to take advantage of breezes and manage wind. So the balcony is valued as an environmental buffer zone for climate modulation, and residents' knowledge of climate is high. Meanwhile, air conditioning equipment installed on the balcony was a major source of annoyance to both residents and neighbours. The heat and the noise generated by split system condensers caused discomfort and deterred use. When asked what they would change, the desire for larger, better designed, space was mentioned most frequently, followed by noise reduction of both neighbours' voices and traffic noise. And people wanted better choice regarding their control over the thermal comfort of their dwelling. When it came to shared outdoor spaces, these were used infrequently by many residents. For example, more than 2/3 had a swimming pool in their complex, yet only 10% used it on a daily basis. 19% used it weekly, 40% about once a month, and 31% stated they never used the pool. They sometimes used a communal barbecue to cook, but generally retreated to their private dwelling to eat or entertain. And the interviews revealed that residents like to keep to themselves. They avoided the shared areas and preferred casual interactions in the wider community beyond the building complex. Some attributed this to concerns about invading other people's privacy, or to others' perceived actions for territoriality in those spaces. So they preferred to maintain a simple hello kind of a relationship with people in the building, and didn't want to feel pressure or an obligation to engage more deeply. For these reasons, despite being annoyed by traffic noise, some residents indicated a preference for apartments with balconies facing the street rather than those overlooking an internal communal courtyard. So what does all of this mean? The survey and interview results clearly indicate that apartment residents in the subtropical city of Brisbane consider interaction with the external environment to be important, and that privately owned outdoor spaces are desirable as extensions of the home that offer residents social and environmental livability benefits. They regard these spaces as important alternative living areas whose spatial and environmental qualities are distinct from the indoor living environment. And they provide for an array of everyday domestic activities. And the findings confirm that lack of a balcony was considered an omission in good apartment design. However, unlike decks or similar spaces in a private house, which are more likely to face the backyard, in apartment buildings, a balcony is often the residents' only access to private space, and is usually located at the front of the building, right on the street. And while some residents indicated a preference for locating balconies on street elevations rather than the more private communal open space, this was linked to a desire for anonymity and a wish to avoid being constantly on view to their immediate neighbours. So the need to design the balcony for usability and ways to manage traffic noise, yet allow residents freedom to choose to open doors and windows, is a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. While better design solutions that achieve visual and aural privacy, they can achieve acoustic shielding from traffic noise, spaciousness, multi-purpose functionality, casual surveillance and views, they're a low priority when developers wish to present expansive views as the most desirable factor for potential residents. The glazed balustrade may have a high impact at point of sale, but meets few other livability attributes in the subtropics. Rather than maximising residents' views and amenity and having a positive effect on public space, extensive glazing actually inhibits both resident utility and casual surveillance. Glazed walls and balustrades provide minimal privacy, offer little sun protection, exacerbate problems of perceived unsightliness by others, possibly leading to public perceptions of the low amenity of the buildings themselves. It's less clear how well shared open spaces are contributing to livability. Our findings are consistent with other researchers who have found social withdrawal rather than sociality in these spaces. And we're not suggesting that such space is not important. It's more likely that the way that people want to use communal space is less well understood. Such spaces are often designed to meet quantitative rather than qualitative requirements, and they may lack spatial quality or aesthetic content, and they're often dominated by a single use and climatically inhospitable, hot and shadeless. So rather than the no shade building, we're kind of keen on shade in the subtropics. So a no man's land rather than an interactional space. They're in compliance with planning requirements rather than being well integrated in overall building design. Instead, shared outdoor spaces have the potential to play a decisive role in the way that the residents and the buildings interact with each other and the environment. For example, substantial and well-planned subtropical vegetation in these spaces can provide both a desirable green outlook and visual privacy between dwellings and shared open space, as well as the cooling effects of shade. The ever-increasing extent of external glazing used in apartment buildings may lead inexorably to hermetically sealed dwellings in subtropical cities with dramatic implications. As well as losing their sense of connection to the subtropical environment, more residents will no longer have the choice to ventilate naturally, but will need to use air conditioning in their dwellings year-round rather than at their own discretion. And I think residents are likely to be far less satisfied with apartment living as a permanent option when this occurs. Buildings that are significantly energy dependent will also hinder residents' ability to participate in actions for greenhouse gas emissions reductions and lead to further discontent. And I say this because earlier analysis of the survey data, which was collected as the city endured a severe drought, found that residents desired participation in civic life, specifically water conservation at that time. And aspects of apartment buildings presented barriers for residents' actions to save water. Currently, electricity from coal-fired power stations is the primary source of energy in Queensland, and though renewables are increasing, it's likely that this will remain so for the immediate future. So in conclusion, residents do seek usable outdoor spaces in apartment buildings in the subtropical zone, and I think the evidence here presented here supports the theory that a locality's climate has a significant impact on the local lifestyle and culture. It also offers support to the theory that buildings that relate culturally and climatically to their location are inherently more livable and sustainable than models developed for dissimilar contexts. At a practical level, the findings present an opportunity for architects to respond, helping to contribute to a cultural change that will make multi-storey residential buildings in subtropical humid cities more socially and environmentally acceptable. But this hybrid climate, hybrid between tropical and temperate, requires deft application of different climate responsive design principles simultaneously to ensure that communal and private open space can contribute more positively to livable and sustainable apartment buildings. With wind effects and at height and super tall buildings posing a major challenge to outdoor space, unlike equatorial Singapore, for example, where air movement is very low velocity, these are some things that we're really going to have to weigh up in the subtropical zone. And just finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Australian Research Council, which provided a grant to conduct this study in partnership with the Port of Brisbane Authority.